Perfect. Okay, so first this morning we will be hearing from Alfred Lin. So, Dr. Lin, a research fellow at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. And his main research speciality includes the migration study, labour study, scientific and statistical computing, big and open data, data science, data engineering, and open science. Alfred is definitely in the right place this morning. He has been serving as a consultant for a number of Taiwan's central government agencies. And since 2013, he devotes himself to the research on hard-to-reach population and the Taiwan Indigenous peoples. So very much look forward to hearing from Dr. Lin this morning, and let's please welcome him to the lectern.
It's my pleasure to be invited to present my research about the Taiwan indigenous people in the past 20 years. And I got 20 minutes, 1 minute, 1 year. It's pretty fair. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Australian indigenous people who was the second wave of Homo sapiens migration from Ethiopia 65,000 years ago. And now I move to my speech. And my speech main thing is about the scientific computing and the data science and open science. And I know because all of you are experts in this discipline, so I won't focus too much about methodological and technical issues. And I'll focus on the issues and the challenges we encountered in the past 25 years, and how can we find a solution to solve these issues and overcome these challenges. Okay, and finally, you will understand how data is powerful and the data is knowledge. And after my presentation, I am pretty sure you will understand how Taiwanese indigenous people have been transformed from the least known and the most marginalized and the most underdeveloped population to the most respectful and well-recognized population in Taiwan, also in the world. Okay, now we take a look at the picture is the contemporary tips, okay? And the tips belong to the so-called Malaysia, Polynesia, or Australian population, which are the most widespread population in the world. And now I move to the reason about data shortage about Taiwan indigenous people. In early 17th century, we really had a lot of data on Taiwan indigenous people, including qualitative data and quantitative data from Dutch colonial governors. Okay, and in late 17th century, Taiwan first became part of Chinese Qing dynasty. And because the Chinese Qing dynasty disallowed immigrants from China, okay, to join together with Taiwan indigenous people in fear of rebellion. So the Qing dynasty had a red line. Nobody was allowed to cross the red the areas on the right red line. And the areas on the red line refer to the traditional indigenous areas. And because of this, we don't have any detailed information or even rough data about the indigenous area and the indigenous people. And in 1895, when Imperial Japan defeated Qing dynasty, and Taiwan became part of Imperial Japan. And we know the perspective of Imperial Japan was pretty different from Chinese perspective, because they understand the indigenous area faces Pacific Oceans, and Japan is an oceanic country, so they need to know more about the indigenous area. So the Japanese government of Formosa spent around 40 years to conquer the indigenous areas. Okay, so that's why, and because of this, so the Japanese government of Formosa also began collecting official data like the population census from 1905, 1915, and so on and so forth, and also to build the household register data and conducted a lot of official service. And because the indigenous areas after the year 1930s became not that dangerous to move in, so that's why you see many pioneer studies in Taiwan about the indigenous people were mainly conducted by Japanese scholars. And you take a look at the picture, okay? On the bottom of this slide, you see the indigenous. We finally got some detailed information around the indigenous, Taiwan indigenous people. And when times moved to the year 1940, and I'd like to say, and the period between 1940 to year 2000 was the data dark age of Taiwan indigenous people. There are two reasons. The first reason is due to the World War II Pacific Wars in 1940 to 1945. And because of this, the Japanese government of Formosa stopped collecting indigenous people. And I'd like to mention a little bit. You Australians know you joined the Pacific War to fight with the Japanese army in New Guinea and many places. But I'd like to tell you the truth. Many of the Japanese armies in World War II were Taiwan indigenous people because they were pretty excellent jungle warriors. And after the World War II, the regime changed, and the Chinese nationalists took over Taiwan. And in 1950, the nationalists or KMT Kuomintang moved from China to Taiwan after being defeated by Chinese Communist Party. And there was a huge change, okay, because the Chinese nationalists emphasized the national ideology. So from the 1945 to 1990, we are forced to mention we are Chinese. We are not allowed to speak. We are Taiwanese, or even not allowed to speak Taiwanese, not to mention Taiwanese indigenous people. However, situation changed in late 1980s and 1990s because of the political democratization and the people in Taiwan eager to change. So there are many movements. In addition to political movements, we see many social and cultural movements. And one of the most important movements is Taiwan's indigenous movements. And the leader of Taiwan's indigenous movement understand because we don't have indigenous data for more than 60 years. And indigenous people really existed, but they are disappearing because no data on indigenous people. No data on indigenous people. And because of the long-term shortage on indigenous people, Taiwan's indigenous people became very marginalized and very discriminated and were associated with much higher unemployment level and much lower life expectancy, and with very low social mobility and social status. Okay, so in year 2000, Taiwanese government decided to resume indigenous population census, and I'd like to mention I was pretty lucky when I finished my PhD degree in Canada. And I returned to Taiwan. I got the opportunity to analyze and to process the raw data of year 2000 Taiwan population census. And this was the first time I got the information on Taiwan indigenous people. And you see the graph on the right side. And I created this graph in year 2002, and this is the first time we got the detailed population distribution of tips based on the census tracts. And when times moved to the after year 2000, because Taiwanese government decided not to conduct the 2010 census, so we now got an issue. How can we get a more detailed information about our indigenous people? And I had the Council of Indigenous Affairs had been discussed with you for many years, and my proposal is the only solution is we can make use of Taiwan household register, and based on this register data, we can build and enrich and integrate all the data together to build very detailed indigenous data. And after more than 3 years of negotiation, the officers who kept saying, "Oh, my idea was pretty good," but they never took any question. And I finally come to realize the root of problem is because the fear of breaking the law and violating privacy. So I wish to do something big. So I came up with an idea. I propose to sign a legal document saying, I am the sole person to take the sole responsibility if there is something which breaks the laws and violates privacy. I am the only person to take the responsibility. And because of this, the officers feel relaxed, and we got a chance to get access to the household register raw data. So this is the first stage. We finally overcome the accessibility to raw data. But now the second challenge is how can we overcome the legal and ethical and privacy issue. And the traditional measure is to use the old school, the in-house lab. But I personally dislike in-house lab very much because when I studied in Canada, I used to go to the branch office of Statistics Canada, and the branch office in University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, okay, to analyze the population census data and some other raw data. And I know this design is pretty bad, not effective. So I give out this idea, so I finally come out to realize the only solution is to use, okay, the so-called distributed computing and the distributed storage methodology based on Google's well-known paper. And based on this, I devised a method to transfer, okay, to transfer the raw data into a data. The data will contain at least 95% information of the raw data, but nobody can violate, can get any personal information data. And because of this, my team member were pretty happy to use this data. So I can, because I am a typical copyleft guy when I was an undergraduate student. So why not open the data to the international society? So in year 2014, I decided to open all the data to the open science framework, okay? And then now I secure about the open science and open data and open source and so on and so forth. And everybody knows about the data science and the big data, and I secure this part. And in terms of scientific computing, I think that this is the most important part I need to overcome because I require computing power, very fast computing. And the main computing power is I made use of the so-called in-memory computing, which refers to overclocking the CPU and overclocking the DRAM, and also to widen the bus of data transfer between the CPU and the DRAM. So, and this technique is something like now the so-called HBM, high bandwidth memory. And without this breakthrough in memory computing, my research won't be able to continue. And because my research grants don't have that much money, so I assembled all of my computing facility and my cluster computers, okay, by myself, and fine-tune all of the performance. So you can see the performance change in the past from the year 2013 to 2023. And I skipped this part about the procedure of building open data. So I open all the data to the world. And there are many types of open data, okay? On open science, you got interest, you can take a look. And the most important principle is of the open data should be easy to use. So the open data offer the most popular format for the ordinary people, so they don't have to spend much time on data transfer, okay? And now, in my research, I focus on two main purposes. The first one is temporal information, and the second one is spatial information. And I spent around 4 years, okay, to crack, not hack, okay, to crack the encryption of Google Map. So because the raw data have a very detailed address, so which I developed a program which can automatically to pass the information from Google Map based on the address information in the data. So we get a very detailed information on the tips distribution for the first time. And the second most important data is the so-called population dynamic data. And I believe this is the first authentic 100% individual level population dynamic data. And not only does this data allow us to do the so-called birth and death and the migration dynamics, but it also enables us to do some dynamics like marriage dynamics, family dynamics, and neighborhood dynamics. And I skip this part. So based on the integration of very detailed spatial information and very short temporal information, so for example, we finally are able to do, for example, the migration dynamics. And in my research, I also use supercomputer to build individual level genealogy data. And because genealogy data is pretty sensitive, so I never open this genealogy data to the public. And I am for sure this is the second individual level genealogy data. And the first one was built by accident. Okay. And 2 years ago, I finally finished quantitative indigenous communities in Taiwan, and which enable people to know the exact location and information around the indigenous community. So the most important positive change is we know where the traditional communities and promote tourism, for example. And there are so many positive changes and the positive effect. And finally, last year, I finally finished the ethnic genealogical lineage quantitative data. And the first qualitative research on genealogical lineage research was conducted around 90 years ago by some Japanese scholars. And finally, I'd like to emphasize we need to have a strong link with the real world. When the data grows, and finally, I cannot explain the content of the data. So I love mountain climbing, and I love hiking. I love cycling. So in addition to conventional interview or survey or focusing group, I make use of, for example, the cycling to travel around Taiwan to take this opportunity to talk with many people, and I collect a lot of information, and which has helped me in turn to interpret the data. And so the concluding remarks is something like this. I quick this part. And the fastness is pretty important. 15 years ago, people love to mention about big data, and 7 years ago, people talk a lot about the machine learning and so on and so forth, and now people talk about AI. But to my knowledge, AI is nothing new. Okay, the fundamental theory of AI have been well established in early 1980s. And the most important component in AI is the first one is data. The second one is computing power. And my research in the past 20 years have finished the goal. So the next step will go into the very sophisticated computing in AI. So I conclude the positive contribution in my research is I make the research from closed to open, from elite to ordinary, and from local to global, and the research from macro to individual level. So I stop here, and thank you for your attention, and salute to the angels of koala and kangaroo. Thank you.
Is this working? Is this working? Yes. Right. Alfred, Dr. Lin, thank you so much for that. I think we've got time for just one question. So if you'd like to take your microphone back for a moment, and we will see, hopefully. It's the seeing bit that's the problem. I think I can see a question in the middle there. Go for it. Is a microphone coming your way? Thank you, Andrew. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk, Professor Lin. I'm Geeta Yadav from India, and I really appreciate the effort you've made for TIPs, for the peoples in Taiwan. And my question is, can scientific computing and open data ever truly empower indigenous communities, or are we mostly empowering the institutions that have the funding and infrastructure to process and publish the data sets of these people?
Yes. When I conducted my research 15 years ago, nobody believed in open data, open science, and nobody trusted me. And finally, the international community know my research and know the positive change and the power of open data and open science. So because of this, now Taiwanese academic community begins to appreciate my foresight 15 years ago. So it's really take time to do that. Yeah, and really make a lot of change, positive change. For example, in Taiwan's academic community.
Fantastic, an excellent question. So, shortness of time, don't forget we've got morning tea. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Lin for an amazing talk. Just a second.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so now for our second speaker, we're going to have Niklas Labba joining us. So Niklas Labba grew up as a traditional reindeer herder. That's a bit unusual for us, and has had for many years initiated partnerships between Sami communities and the EU Interact network. He's been elected to the board of directors of the Interact non-profit association, so that's the International Network for Terrestrial Research and Monitoring in the Arctic. It's a network of 99 terrestrial field bases scattered across all Arctic countries and in adjacent northern, boreal and alpine areas. So we're going to hear from Niklas today, and it's a very interesting perspective at the top of the world, and just wonderful that he's made the long journey to join us here in Brisbane again. Thank you, Niklas. The stage is yours.
Nice to be back in Brisbane again. It's been 1 year since I was last here, and it will be as interesting now as it was then. But I would want to start by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional owners, Turrbal and Yurega peoples, on whose land we meet, and pay respect to their elders, past and in present. So, as I said, it's nice to be here again. My name is Niklas Labba, and I am representing the Sami, myself as a Sami person, but also the Interact Network non-profit association. And today I'm going to talk about the Sami people, the only indigenous people of Northern Europe, and how we are working to secure control over our own data. That's what we call data sovereignty. Around the world, indigenous peoples are realizing that the information about them, from health to language to land, often sits in governmental databases or universities outside their control. The Sami has responded to this and developed their own approach, SUDA, the Sami Ownership and Data Access Principle. These principles built on earlier indigenous models like OCAP from the northern, the First Nations in Canada, but it also reflects the Samo values and how we experience it. But also, of course, the care principle is a part of this. So now you may think, where does the man come from? As you see the map, we are up in the northern Scandinavia, and the numbers are an estimate how many persons that identify themselves as Sami. So Sami lives across the Nordic parts of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. We are fully part of the Scandinavian societies with equal access to welfare, education, and health system. But historically, the Sami people lost much of our own culture and control because of the assimilation policies and the way the Western institutions manage Sami data and research. Despite this, Sami culture remains strong. We have reindeer herding, fishing, farming. We have our own dwedje, like you see my dress. We have our own singing style, that's called joik. Today, the challenge is to combine modern life and technology with respect for values. Values and anatomy. The Sami are a modern indigenous people with Asian traditions and equal citizenship, but a history of losing control of their knowledge. The Sami have their own political bodies. We have 3 Sami parliaments, one in Norway, Sweden, and in Finland. These parliaments, they are democratically elected, and the election process is based on a self-identification and a language criteria. So there are no geographical criteria to be able to elect in the Sami parliaments. They are founded nationally, but operate independently on Sami issues. The oldest cross-border body in the Sami is the Sami Council, established in the 50s. It brings together Sami organizations from all 4 countries and represents Sami internationally. What's important here is that the Sami Council was the one who developed the SUDA principle. Principles which defines how Sami data should be owned, shared, and protected. Remember, I said should, because we do not have that access yet to say that we control our own data. Sami political institutions and cross-border corporations are essential for managing Sami data. So cooperation, that is how we can build up a database future. So the Sami Raddi, as we call it, they made this SODA principle, and it defines who owns Sami data and how it can be accessed. It's also balancing openness with protection. SUDA stands for Sami Ownership and Data Access. It defines 2 core rights. Ownership. Sami communities corporately own their data. And 2, access. Sami people has the right to access information about themselves, no matter where it's stored. The Sami Councils demands co-ownerships and even a right to veto when research or institutions want to use sensitive data. Some data can and should be shared, for example, language or climate data that help build new knowledge. But other data must remain protected, for example, secret places, reindeer herding data, or personal community information. SUDA is similar to the OCAP principles in Canada: ownership, control, access, and possession, but adapted to the Sami context and values. When we are talking about the Sami people, We have 4 languages that we are still actively using today. We have strong education institutions, like the Sami University of Applied Science in Kautokeino, Norway, and the Sami Education Center in Jokkmokk, Sweden. Language data is increasingly used in technology. We have projects like the WAHPA or Neurotolg that build translation tools and language technology. However, copyright rules often limit what language material can be shared. So even though the Sami language is rich, we have radio, we have literatures, education materials, and even the Bible is translated to Sami language. Sharing language data could strengthen technology and help preserving linguistic equality. We also have archives. They're not just Sami archives, but there's a part of the state system. In Norway, we have that, what we call a Sami archive. And this archive has a national responsibility to collect, preserve, and provide access to Sami materials. So it's not just gathering it, but it's always to provide access for the data. For example, the archive shares old photographies through Flurk. These are the pictures without no copyright anymore, old pictures. We have a new project that's called Nuhti. Nuhti is a fishing net that we draw around. So it's like collecting things. And this is developed by the Sami University of Applied Science to connect Sami archives and museums collections online. The Sami parliaments, they also manage 6 Sami museums with handicrafts, cultural objects, including drums. Some of this information like Sami place names, they're quite politically sensitive. Because if you say that you use a landscape or a name of that land or mountain, it means that Sami has been built before, like extractive industries. So place names are politically sensitive in many ways. We have secret sites that are registered in national databases, but they are not open because we want to protect their sensitivity or the holiness of their places, so we don't put them out with GPS spots. Reindeer herding is just one of the main foundations of Sami culture and economy today. Like all businesses, Sami enterprises appear in national statistics, meaning much of our data is public. Examples include membership, leadership, reindeer earmark registers, and slaughter and animal level data. But as in everything else, there's also always exceptions. In Finland, the data is not public. Reindeer herding data in Finland belongs to the communities. It's not the government. So this raises a question: who truly owns herding data? Should outsiders like mining or energy companies have access? Should the community benefit financially if others use that data? Reindeer data is a clear case where SUDA helps guide what should be open and what should be protected. Yes, there it is. Yeah, technology works. Perfect. So technology, of course. Technology will change reindeer herding. Today we have GPS trappers around the necks of reindeers to monitor the movements of the animals. We use drones. We have sensors collecting environment data. And soon we probably could use machine learning, AI, to identify individual reindeers. Today we earmark reindeers, like cuts in the ears, because a calf is born without earmarks. So climate and snow data could help plan grazing, how to use the landscape. So that data could be a benefit for the single reindeer herding business. So all this data, they are valuable tools, but also a source of sensitive data. Who can see and use this data? What happens if industries or researchers use it? Should the Sami people have the ownership, access, and benefits? Of course. In an ideal world, I would say that the FAIR principle should be in one way used in the Sami case also, to have data findable, accessible, interruptible, and reusable, but always on Sami terms, that it will not be the terms of researchers or the industry. But what we can state is that new technologies bring opportunities and new questions about control. So today, both Sami and international governments recognize the importance of indigenous data sovereignty. Collaboration with research institutions is growing. For example, the Interact that I'm a part of, we have done lots of work with climate change, and climate data must be fair. So the goal is to refine existing archives and create a Sami-controlled data infrastructure. Systems where Sami people decide what is stored, shared, or protected. Data sovereignty strengthens Sami education, economy, climate research, and ethical standards. Sami and national actors are now aligning to support indigenous data sovereignty. To close this session, the future of Sami data sovereignty will depend on how much power the state is willing to share. Technology and collaboration is important, but they must come with respect, consent, and community benefit. SUDA is just not a technical policy. It is actually a political statement that indigenous people have the right to define their own digital future. So data is a new form of self-determination and must be governed according to Sami values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niklas. That's wonderful. We have time for some questions now. Yep. So again, if you could raise your hand. Thank you. We have a question. I think we have, I've just been told there's a hand over this side of the room.
Yeah.
I can't see, Andrew, because of the lights. So you go for it. Give someone a microphone.
Yeah. Thank you, Niklas, for that presentation. So we know data ownership right now is a very contentious issue, as you pointed out. And there are two main arguments: the data subjects who claim that we should own it because it comes from us, and then you have the data processors who say we create value out of it, therefore we should own it. So both make sense, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the music industry. So the idea is, how about the data subjects get royalties? So you kind of touched on it. What is so data subjects get royalties for whenever the data is being used. What do you think about that idea?
Well, it's a good question. I know that the Sami Council, they have said that if future research projects will go on, the data will be co-owned between the Sami Council and the Research Institute. It's not just a question of benefits of it, but it's the question about when to be able to say that, no, we will not let this data be used again, or saying that, yes, we want this data to be used. So the benefit might be the one that the control is amongst the Sami people.
Thank you. And I think there was another question there as well.
Hi. Yep. Thanks, Niklas. That was really, really interesting. One thing that I'm curious about is you talked about the different Sami communities existing in different countries. Do you find that there are tensions between how do different governments regard the Sami data and data sovereignty rights differently? And is that something that you have to balance as a community?
Yes, there's a big difference between the different states. So as I was talking about Sami archive, it's a Norwegian archive. And of course, the cross-border reindeer herding, for example, that Sami registered like myself in Sweden, actually use the land of Norway. So it's a sensitive thing, and there's been lots of conflict between the states. So we haven't solved it yet, but the Sami people are collaborating, and we want to have a shared data system. What the national states does, it's another question.
Well, thank you. That was exactly going to be my question as well. Very interesting. So, thank you, Niklas. Great to welcome you here again. Sorry. Oh, I beg your pardon,
Rosie.
Hilary. Go for it. We do have time.
Niklas, thank you for the presentation. Hilary Hanaho, the Research Data Alliance. 7 years ago, at International Data Week in Botswana, the CARE principles were formed, as you may know. So with this wonderful audience of over 700 people here, is there anything you would like them to do this week for Indigenous data? What can the community do for all of you? But I give you the question. Thanks, Niklas.
That was a really good question, and I think that what we could do together, all of us, is to open up our minds and really start to think about what's the difference between the fair care and OPAC or the SUDA principle, or what's common with them. We all is common about that research, and as researchers, there's must to have this ethical thing in mind all the time, but also think about whose data do we really use in our research, and how it could be actually protected if needed.
Thank you, Hilary. Now, before I was too quick then, any further final question for Niklas? Marcia, go for it.
Hi. I'm Marcia Krauses, president of CODATA and also at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And thanks again, also like all the others in the audience for this great talk. So the thought about the protection for this type of data brings me the discussions that from years we've had with different entities about the patient data, right? Clinical data and patient data. There are some the systems, like for example, years ago, it started with the My Data Can, the idea that for patients have their own, have control of how they share their own data. So could we, maybe in these settings of the conferences like that, could we look at the differences and similarities about, again, the ownership or the governance of patient data that in some ways are, have the same protection and sensitivity issues?
I didn't understand the question really. What was it?
Patients from the clinical data.
Yeah.
So because the governance that are needed for how to share that data could have similarities about again for different people's data that they want to choose the control of how you share, and there is some voluntarism. To share it for a specific research purpose. So this type of governance could also apply here, or could be at least compared.
The Sami people do not have any archives with genetic data or any hospital, because that is the states, if I would understand you right. So we do not own that data, and I think that the ethical standards of Scandinavia is quite good to protect the individual rights of a person. So I'm sorry, I cannot answer that question more than that.
We'll talk about it. I didn't mean.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcia. I think that is an interesting point. What are the ethical considerations that overlap from the CARE principles to the broader sensitive data, whether it's in health research or perhaps, commercial in confidence with industry as well. So it's a topic for conversation as the week goes on, I think. Now, you've given us a wonderful opportunity to ask you plenty of questions, so one more?
Yes, of course.
One more? I think we have one more over there.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Harun Ahmad from the Australian Research Council. Excellent presentation. My question is more around a bit of a policy question, given that I represent government body. When we talk about data use and data control in a fair and care principle coming together, do we, from your perspective, I would love to hear your perspective on existing data sources. If there is an existing data source about an Indigenous population, in our case Australian population, how do you apply the control principle there? How do you see that happening in a practical sense? Or if I put the question another way, if there is existing data source which is publicly available, what's your view on using that, and how do the Indigenous people benefit from that?
I think in many cases, Indigenous people need to build up the competence to use the data or to build up their own infrastructures. So there's many steps to take forward. So we are just seeing the start of it yet. So it must be some kind of organ that really, there will be needed financing, capacity building through humans, with more educations, but also some kind of a political or some kind of organization within the Indigenous communities that takes the responsibility to make lines or guidelines towards the future.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And Niklas, a wonderful presentation again. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So to the final speaker in our opening plenary session, it is an absolute delight to welcome Professor Marcia Langton AO. Marcia Langton AO, an anthropologist and geographer, and since 2000 has held the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. She's produced a large body, an enormous body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, and Indigenous culture and art. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Marcia to the lectern for the final presentation this morning.
Thank you, Rosie. First of all, let me acknowledge the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yagara people, who are the traditional owners of the areas here in and around Mianjin. So I want to pay my respects to them and to their elders, past, present and emerging. So what I want to talk to you about today is how we are embedding Indigenous data governance in Australia's national research infrastructure. So with the support of the Australian Research Data Commons, we are building an Indigenous data commons. We've come a long way. We have a number of streams in our work and a wonderful team of people and a network. So we are elaborating on Indigenous data governance and sovereignty, Indigenous data catalogue resources and extensions, Indigenous spatio-temporal frameworks and infrastructure, data capability building for digital futures in Indigenous Australia, and Indigenous repositories and data rematriation. So just by the by, I was very interested to hear about the sponsor of this session, Sense Sciences, and the use of AI. It occurred to me that with all of the orphaned Indigenous data sets collected by researchers over more than 2 centuries now, it might be useful to use AI in exploring these orphan data sets that sit on people's drives and, sadly, in garages and sheds, and sometimes libraries. So these foundational streams and substreams are designed to collectively lead to improved Indigenous research data practice across Australia. That's a visual image of our research design. I'm very honoured to speak to you today about the framework for the governance of Indigenous data, developed through the Hassan Indigenous Research Data Commons. This is not just a policy document that we're developing, it's a practical roadmap for embedding Indigenous data governance across research infrastructure and community settings. So this slide shows our partners and our team members who work on our key project, improving Indigenous research capabilities. Why does Indigenous data governance matter? Indigenous people have long called for greater control over data that affects our lives, lands, cultures and futures. And the first two speakers explained this perfectly well in their own cases. Historically, data has been extracted, misrepresented or withheld from communities. The framework that we're developing responds to those injustices by affirming our rights to self-determination, cultural authority and equitable participation in research ecosystems. We define Indigenous data broadly to include cultural, ecological, linguistic, genealogical and community-generated knowledge, whether held by governments, institutions or communities themselves. One of the principles that underpins our approach is Article 31 of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights, which states that Indigenous people have rights to Indigenous autonomy in relation to internal and local affairs and in relation to cultural, human and genetic resources. So as an example, we train researchers to take responsibility for understanding the meaning of self-determination and the rights articulated in the Declaration and how these rights can be recognised in research, recognising and differentiating between individual, group and or collective rights, responsibilities and ownership, and undertaking research only if it does not conflict with individual rights, freedom and dignity. For instance, we hosted this last weekend the Indigenous Datathon at the Queensland University of Technology with more than 50 participants, most of them volunteers, and 2 medical de-identified data sets were made available to them for the first time ever to analyse and produce original findings in accordance with the fair and care principles. So these were linked data sets. And some of the outcomes of our weekend were remarkable original insights derived from this linked data, say especially in relation to kidney disease and renal replacement therapy or renal dialysis. And so it emerged very clearly that the role of Aboriginal liaison officers in hospitals for renal patients needs to be much better documented in the forms that are filled in hospitals and therefore in the data that hospitals hold about kidney patients. So that's just an example. But it goes to another one of our principles, and that is how do we contribute to the Closing the Gap national partnership of Australian governments with the Coalition of Australian Peaks. This is a national strategy for overcoming the disadvantages of Indigenous Australians. There are 4 priority reforms, and so we approach priority 4 as a key goal of our project. Priority 4 reform calls for shared access to data and information at a regional level. If you're Australian, you've probably noticed that the Close the Gap National Report presents the Australian public with big crunched mean data in relation to targets and no granular data usually, so that we have no idea about what is actually being achieved by the more than 3,000 Indigenous communities in Australia, spread across the entire continent and often located in urban peripheries and rural and remote areas with very small populations. So that goes to the quality of the data that's being used and presented in the Close the Gap policy approach of Australian governments. And obviously Aboriginal people are finding this extremely unsatisfactory in relation to how data about us is used, because it results in a deficit discourse each year, kind of annual misery fest when the Close the Gap report is presented in Parliament. So priority 4, reform 4, asks for establishing formal partnerships that support Indigenous governance and decision making, strengthening the community control sector through investment in infrastructure, workforce and governance, addressing institutional racism to ensure culturally safe service access, and enabling Indigenous communities to access and use data to drive their own development. And these reflect the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their corporations, their community control services, their service providers, their land councils across the country. And it addresses too the importance of access to regionally disaggregated and locally relevant data to support informed decision making by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So the Productivity Commission reviewed the National Agreement on Closing the Gap and made several key findings. 1, shared decision-making commitments are rarely realised in practice. Government policy does not adequately reflect the value of the community controlled sector, and organisational transformation within government shows little evidence of progress. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led data initiatives are not sufficiently enabled. Performance reporting offers only a partial view of progress, insufficient accountability mechanisms to deliver the agreement's commitments. So they're quite profoundly important and harsh judgments that have been made also by the Productivity Commission. But in our project, in developing an Indigenous data commons, and we're in the phase where we are addressing the research infrastructure and Indigenous data governance needs of humanities and social sciences and Indigenous research. We support those findings and we are finding ways to address them. So, for example, when we work with our teams at roundtables, at the Datathon, and in various other exercises, we're called upon to explain what Indigenous data sovereignty means. And so we felt it important to share our views on this here. While Indigenous data sovereignty remains a vital and ethical political claim in Australia, it lacks formal legal recognition. That's why we focus on governance, a pragmatic, culturally grounded approach that enables communities to enact sovereignty in practice. Governance is relational, iterative and adaptable. It allows Indigenous communities to negotiate authority over Indigenous knowledge systems, and the concept itself while it's a powerful manifesto in relation to the control of data, it presents various very practical problems. The language of sovereignty may hold political resonance, yet it is also conceptually and legally fraught. In the Australian context, Indigenous sovereignty is not formally recognised by the state and as such lacks enforceable legal standing. This creates a fundamental tension. Indigenous communities may assert sovereignty over data, but without institutional mechanisms to uphold these claims, sovereignty remains largely symbolic. And the concept itself, traditionally associated with the supreme authority, independence and self-governance within defined territorial boundaries, has been a foundation of international law and political theory. In the Westphalian model of nation-states, sovereignty encompasses territorial integrity, legal authority and non-intervention principles. However, applying this concept to Indigenous contexts, particularly when addressing Indigenous data, really does present significant theoretical and practical challenges. Sorry? The transposition of traditional sovereignty concepts to data governance encounters several epistemological and ontological obstacles. The digital nature of data transcends geographical boundaries, complicating jurisdictional delineations. Further, the frequent traversal of data across multiple legal jurisdictions problematises the assertion of exclusive sovereign control. The complexity is particularly acute for Indigenous people whose existence within nation states, often, that claim overarching sovereignty creates potential conflicts in the assertion of data sovereignty. There's also a contentious historical legacy that goes back to the doctrine of discovery and assertions of colonial sovereignty by imperial powers. And so the term has become rather confused in the public discourse and, for instance, is often associated with the sovereign citizen movement. And that confusion presents us with enormous practical problems, but we have found a more pragmatic and more culturally appropriate framework for addressing these challenges. So we address the practical aspects of managing, controlling and utilising data, which are the core concerns for Indigenous people, but at the same time providing flexibility in a range of practices, principles and systems that reflect our diverse Indigenous approaches to data management. Governance approaches align with collaborative methodologies, facilitating work within the existing legal and political frameworks. While we do not disagree with Indigenous data sovereignty as abstract rights, in the present absence of Australian policy and laws recognising the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty, our concern is to map out practical pathways to effective Indigenous data governance, greater recognition of Indigenous data assets and Indigenous ownership of and rights in data, and the rights of Indigenous people as data custodians. Their legal rights to use, share, store and report such data and compliance with their decisions about data use. And in the end, the credibility of this framework lies in its effectiveness in enabling greater empowerment of Indigenous people by recognising their rights in data and their data-driven pursuit of social and cultural well-being and improved political status. So these distinctions we make are not merely semantic. It's a matter of fact that the present law, the data legislation in Australia, makes no mention whatsoever of Indigenous people. And so you heard Australia's Chief Scientific Officer say this morning that the legislation has reached its sunset clause almost and is being revised. And so the question is, will the new legislation relating to data make any mention at all of Indigenous people and recognise our rights in accordance with the rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, ICIP rights, and, you know, very practical issues like enabling the care and fair principles in relation to Indigenous data. So our framework is informed by two complementary sets of principles: the care principles for Indigenous data governance and the fair principles for scientific data management. And together they provide a foundation for ethical, inclusive and technically robust data practices across the humanities and social sciences and Indigenous research data commons. So, as you know, the care principles are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics, and the fair principles are findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. I won't go into detail about those because I'm sure everybody in the room is quite familiar with them, but I do want to make brief mention of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights because we also must observe these rights in maintaining our network of partnerships, especially with community organisations across the country. So Indigenous cultural and intellectual property refers to the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to control, protect and benefit from their cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. They arise from Article 31 of the Declaration, and in addition to affirming self-determination and free, prior and informed consent, the Declaration calls for legal and policy safeguards that prevent harm to Indigenous knowledge systems and promote equitable economic opportunities. Again, in Australia, these rights lack direct legislative protection. While some institutions have adopted policies to recognise and safeguard Indigenous knowledge, most collecting institutions do not enable Indigenous communities to exercise governance over their cultural data. Protective policies can inadvertently restrict community access and revitalisation efforts, reinforcing institutional control. This dynamic has been described as a form of new protectionism, where risk-averse approaches position institutions as arbiters of access, perpetuating colonial and paternalistic structures. And that's all set out in a terrific article called The New Protectionism, published by the Indigenous Archives Collective members, including myself. And it's very important to understand that the work of making Indigenous data sovereignty and governance real is constant and ongoing. And there are many touch points, including clinical records, the librarian or archivist that an Indigenous person approaches to access Indigenous data. Our framework has 5 interrelated pillars. Recognition of Indigenous data assets. I realise that we say this over and over again and mostly people have no idea what we're talking about. Well, I'll say it again. We have over 3,000 Indigenous corporations who hold land, who deliver services and who collect data about their members and their country and their culture. That data are what we call Indigenous data assets. They are owned by those Indigenous corporations. And it presents a very strong reason for the Data Act in Australia recognising Indigenous people and recognising our rights. Number 2, partnership, establishing genuine, respectful relationships with Indigenous identities, building capabilities, supporting communities with infrastructure, training and tools, self-determination, enabling Indigenous-led access, interpretation and use of data, inclusive data ecosystem, embedding cultural safety and Indigenous knowledge across systems. So we've developed the Indigenous data catalogue, and that will be it is becoming a primary tool for Indigenous data governance and sovereignty. It's the technical architecture that we're committed to developing under our partnership with the Australian Research Data Commons. We've developed an IDN metadata profile, or Indigenous Data Network metadata profile, metadata entry tools, the Indigenous Data Network catalogue, Indigenous Data Network vocabularies and dictionaries, a catalogue profile, and agents database. And these tools enable Indigenous data custodians to manage, describe and share data in ways that reflect Indigenous priorities and cultural protocols. They support decentralised governance, ensuring local control while enabling interoperability. We also use semantic web and knowledge graph principles to make metadata machine readable and extensible. And the Fair and Care calculator helps assess metadata quality and governance compliance. I wanted to show you an instance of our geospatial mapping and catalogue integration, but the nerds have kind of messed up the system, but it will be available. So this geospatial mapping and catalogue integration is a very exciting development because it visualises data assets across the country, linking cultural, linguistic and ecological knowledge to place. And that integration is very important to Indigenous people. Through the IDN catalogue, users can explore datasets, metadata and vocabularies in a culturally secure environment, and this supports both research and community priorities. So in conclusion, I have a call to action for all of you. Our framework is a living practice. It evolves with community needs, technological developments and policy changes. It's a tool for transforming Australia's research infrastructure and a commitment to uphold Indigenous rights. I invite all institutions, researchers and practitioners to engage meaningfully with Indigenous knowledge systems, adopt the care and fair principles and support the implementation of this framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcia. That was a wonderful talk. Now, we do have time for a couple of questions, and we have them in the middle. You've already had one go. Hang on, let's start over the other side. No. Andrew, there's another one just there.
Thank you so much. You mentioned that Australia draft data protection law doesn't explicitly include Indigenous data rights. From your perspective, how can legislators begin to understand and translate into law that tension between individual equality at the core of most data protection frameworks and the collective principles of care that emphasize community authority and benefit?
Oh, well, thanks for the question. Very good question. We haven't actually drafted the legislative provisions that we'd like to see enacted as yet. But we should, you're right, we should. But in our framework document, we've elaborated on how fair and care principles should be used sensitively in order to support Indigenous rights in data and how data is used and reused. So I think this is, a very straightforward drafting matter for the new legislation. And I would hope that the new legislation would cover the key points that I've raised today.
Thank you.
Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
Thank you, Marcia. Andrew, thank you. You're doing a great job.
Of course. Hello, my name is Amy Nernberger. I'm at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm also a member of RDA Council. Thank you, everyone, for your talks today. I know each of you have mentioned the care principles, and there's much in the care principles that overlap with the concerns, considerations of other marginalized communities, and that makes the care principles really tempting to just wholesale adopt without regard to their original intent. So keeping in mind that the care principles were designed by and for Indigenous communities and their data, how would you like other communities to respect this while seeking to adopt and adapt those care principles to their concerns?
Yeah, well, that's one of the issues we're exploring at the moment. And as I said, we hosted with QUT and ARDC and other institutions, the Indigenous Datathon this last weekend. And we had access to 2 linked data sets provided by medical associations. For the very first time, de-identified data in linked data sets to our Indigenous Datathon participants, not all of whom were Indigenous, people came from all over the country, students and clinical practitioners, epidemiologists, all joined in groups to tackle these linked data sets and to ask questions of the linked data sets in accordance with the care and fair principles with mentors, many Indigenous mentors in the room, and we worked through the problems together. And I think, we learned a lot on the weekend. We learned, for instance, that, first of all, most people especially people who work in data, don't necessarily know about concepts like self-determination or community-controlled organisations. We were asked, what is a community-controlled organisation? And so we had to explain that we have, probably more than 200 now community-controlled Aboriginal medical services and medical and allied support services across the country. They are governed by locally elected Indigenous boards of governance. They have their own constitutions, and they deliver services like clinical services, legal services, housing services. Altogether, we probably have 6,000 of these kinds of corporations and associations in Australia, and they hold data. And also their data is linked to hospital data, Medicare data, Social Security data. And so it's very important to know about these community-controlled organisations and the communities where they are, that there are hundreds of Indigenous languages. So there's work to do in training people to understand how to implement the care and fair principles sensitively. And so the Indigenous Datathon is one way of doing it, but obviously having had this experience and getting to the end of writing our framework for Indigenous data governance in humanities and social science and Indigenous research, we will have to write some manuals. So I think it's that simple.
Thank you, Marcia. And I think we've got time for one final question at the front there.
Rosie, this person got here first, sorry.
Apologies, the tea break follows, and I'll have to ask you to pick that one up then. I'm being overridden.
Hi there. It's a question for the nerds, if that helps. So, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. This is wonderful. Christina Drummond, University of North Texas, I'm the executive director of the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust. We've been working to implement the fair and care principles through the data space protocol. And when I was looking at your slide on the Indigenous Data Network, I could see the FAIR principles reflected. And I'm curious how you were thinking about and operationalizing the CARE principles as we think about compliance. You've spoken about governance, and I don't know if there is a technological way within our infrastructures that we should be thinking about the CARE principles to build in control and accountability mechanisms to ensure that those principles are put into action.
Okay, to go to the nerdy bit straight away, we have to have a look at our Indigenous data catalogue. It's not looking pretty. It will be better designed and more user-friendly before the end of the year. Have a look at our metadata tools. We've established this Indigenous data catalogue, idnau.org. In order to enable people to use a metadata tool to check off the care and fair principles when they are entering metadata into the Indigenous data catalogue in relation to a data set. And there are other tools as well. So that's the nerdy bit, that's the technological bit. And, you know, of course, we'll keep developing that. And we will, you know, trial it in our workshops and Indigenous Datathon and you know, roundtables. We'll need to trial that. And people are trialling it. And, you know, there's a way to go with it. But we've established the basis for doing that. We work with communities in partnership. So we have a wonderful partner here in southwest Queensland, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service. It's the oldest and largest Aboriginal community-controlled health service in Australia. It has thousands of patients. And some years ago, they developed their own data ecosystem and commenced assessing the data maturity of their ecosystem. And when they commenced, I think in about 2018, they used their own funding and they went from 0 on the data maturity score to today they're at 5. So, you know, Indigenous corporations can do it themselves by investing in their infrastructure, designing their platforms, and they've worked very closely with us, and what I've explained to you today arises very much out of our partnership with community-controlled organisations like that health service and others across the country. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcia. Here's our pin. There we go. Thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
One of the things that I really reflect on listening to this morning's 3 fantastic speakers is the very real challenges that all of them are facing globally. I'm struck by the commonalities. I'm also struck by what an exciting point in time we're at, how much change we are seeing, and what the potential for new technologies offers for each of these communities. So please join me again in thanking these speakers.